Good afternoon, everybody. This is Andrew Wright with another Review the Right Thing. It's been about 2 weeks since my last video. Miss you guys, so just got off work, cracking a beer, and let's talk about some stuff, So first of all, how's everybody doing? Hope everybody's still not going crazy and managing to keep a level head during all of this craziness that we're dealing with in our society today. And so just, treat each other right. You get further with honey than you do with vinegar. And, just try to get through the best you can. Really all we can do at this point. And just hope for a better tomorrow. So anyways, we're going to be talking about some music. At the very beginning of me doing this channel, I had done a video on some music that's really important to me that was celebrating some anniversaries. So that was for my first quarter. I've decided to go ahead. We just finished up the second quarter, a couple weeks ago, so 10 days ago, whatever. So it's time to go ahead and get the second quarter one finished. I haven't really watched any movies or anything, so haven't had a whole lot there to talk about. Sorry, I'm picking my eyeball. I had an eyelash. Just been kind of busy. Work, obviously, get home, and it's hard to get motivated to watch anything, especially when, I want to do it right, so I want to watch all the special features, really give a good review on something. But at the same time, when I take too much time, due to work schedule or getting home, and my fiance and I just don't really share the same tastes, so it's hard to put on a movie and start watching it without being distracted by my dogs, or if she's asking me to do stuff, we make dinner, yada yada yada, just life basically just gets in the way sometimes. And so that's why you've seen a lot of music reviews from me lately, because it's just a lot easier for me to do. I can put the music on while I'm driving to work, and then, I wake up a lot of times at 6:30 a.m. I like to give myself plenty of time before I do go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, and so a lot of times I'll sit there and digest the music then as well. So I have a lot more time to really focus on music, and not as much time to focus on movies and Blu-rays. And so, like I said, when they get past a certain point, it's like, I just did that RTJ review, and it's got no hits on it, which I don't care. I'm not doing this for any other reason other than my own entertainment. And if you guys enjoy what you're watching, great. That's a plus. But obviously I did that review weeks after it had been out. And so at that point, it just wasn't as relevant anymore. It's not that my content was necessarily worse, or probably not better than anybody's, but not necessarily that it was worse than anyone's, but everybody had seen everybody else's review on that, and so mine wasn't relevant anymore, just wasn't important. And so it kind of sucks. I know with the Eric Romance set that I still keep mentioning, I'll get to eventually, there's not a ton of people reviewing something like that, but when I pick up a 4K of Jaws and I don't watch it immediately and don't review it immediately, plenty of other people have already done it, and so I'm just going to go to the bottom of the list and just not be as important as somebody else. And it's not that I don't want to do those, but until I have time to really focus on that stuff, if this ever gets to a point to where it becomes more of a part-time thing and I can work part-time instead of working full-time, or maybe I get a job where I'm not working retail and so my hours are a little bit more open to allow me to do these kind of things. Like today, where I get off at 4 o'clock, I have the whole afternoon. Most of the time I'm working 9 to 14 hours a day, so I don't get to come home and do this. So let's take advantage of it. And like I said, we're gonna go ahead and do some music. These are albums that are important to me that are celebrating some anniversaries. So let's go ahead and get started. First up on the list, we have Black Sabbath's Heaven and Hell. Came out April of 1980, celebrating 40 years. This album is important to me because it's, other than being the Ozzy Sabbath that obviously everybody grew up on, and to me Black Sabbath wasn't the same with anybody else. However, Dio really warmed up to me. I don't really like solo Dio, but I think the Dio Sabbath albums can be every bit as amazing as the Ozzy stuff. I think my favorite overall Sabbath has always been Sabotage, just because, much like Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss, it's different than everything else that they had released. You know, it felt like Sabbath was basically putting out self-titled album over and over again. Obviously, there's amazing songs on all those records, not taking anything away from them, but they never really strayed too far from their debut album. You know, they kept putting out these just amazing, you know, heavy metal songs, you know. Whereas Sabotage felt much more like a rock record, and it was totally different. So that album was amazing. To me, Heaven and Hell is on par with Sabotage. Like I said, it's one of the earlier Dio records, or Sabbath Dio. And to me, this album just crushes. It's just got so many good songs on it. And it was just always really influential to my music taste and growing up. Not necessarily when I was younger, because I didn't really start becoming exposed to this stuff until much later in life. My dad was into, you know, various things. I also formed my own tastes when I was in middle school and high school. But then a lot of that stuff I don't listen to anymore because I just discovered things that I liked more. I realized that a lot of that stuff was a little bit more childish, and not in like a negative way, but there's a lot more to music than what I was seeing. And so this album exposed me to something new. Next up, we have Sheila E and Romance 1600. This was her second album after leaving Prince, the Revolution, basically, after leaving the Revolution band and kind of going off on her own thing. And to me, this is just an incredible funk record. It's not super, super funky. Obviously, you know, she kind of does her own thing. She's not trying to follow in Prince's footsteps, but it still feels very Prince-ish. But it's amazing. It's a great record. Came out April 1985, so it is celebrating 35 years. Next, we have A Tribe Called Quest, People's Instinctive Travels, and the Paths of Rhythm. Came out April 1990, celebrating 30 years. They were one of the groups that pretty much exposed me to hip-hop. There was several early 2000s rappers that I really got into that obviously I would argue more exposed me to rap, but you know, it was with those groups that I went back and checked out a lot of the early 90s material. And so obviously these were a group that, you know, came out, and this is their first record, and it is just bam. Not my favorite Tribe album. I think Low End Theory would probably be my favorite. It's probably a little cliche because it's probably most people's favorites, but it'd have to be between that or Midnight Marauders. But still, like, this album, obviously, I always started at the beginning and kind of worked through a band's catalog, and so this was where I started, and it was opened my eyes up to what hip-hop could be, because to me, in the early 2000s, there wasn't much, and obviously I knew my 90s stuff that I was exposed to at the time, but there was, you know, so much underground stuff that I was not exposed to. None of my friends were listening to it, so I didn't go out of my way to try to find it. Back then, we didn't have Discogs, or Wikipedia wasn't a thing until I was in college, and even then, you couldn't really guarantee that all the information on there was correct. Nowadays, obviously, it's a lot more accepted, and they do a lot more to, you know, try to fix things that are incorrect immediately. They have bots covering all that, so it's a lot more relevant, and you can actually trust the things you find on there. Next up, we have Aphex Twin, I Care Because You Do, came out in April of 1995, celebrating 25 years now, and important to me because it's an early electronic album that I got into. Again, electronic was something I didn't get into until, God, even like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, somewhere in that range. To me, electronic just never clicked, and so this was something that a buddy threw on to me, and I was like, holy shit, I don't know what wasn't meshing before, but now I understand. And Aphex Twin is pretty amazing. Great electronic record. Highly recommend it. Next up, we have Cephalic Carnage, Exploiting Dysfunction, came out in April of 2000, celebrating 20 years. And if you're not familiar with Cephalic Carnage, if you like extreme metal, I highly recommend checking this one out. They are in a league of their own, very chaotic, kind of mixes grind with death, very experimental, very abrasive, just chaotic all around. And their later stuff definitely goes more melodic. Song structures are a little bit more cohesive, not as all over the place, but Exploiting Dysfunction is just, it rattles your brain. And so when I heard that album in 2005, a few years later, I was kind of blown away. I had no idea what to expect. I'd never heard anything like it in my life, and it still is something I throw on very often. Next up, we got Del the Funky Homosapien. It's Both Sides of the Brain. Came out in April of 2000, celebrating 20 years also. And again, another one of the early hip-hop that I got into back when I had no idea what to expect from the genre. Like I said earlier, everything in the early 2000s that I was exposed to that you would see in mainstream, radio or MTV or whatever, were basically, the cookie cutter to early 2000s early 2000s rap, and it just wasn't my thing. I didn't like most of that stuff. So again, Del was one of those artists that I was just like, wow, like this is what hip hop and rap can be. This is incredible, and again, highly influenced my tastes. Great record. I recommend anything that Del put out. Honestly, No Need for Alarm was my first thing that I ever got into with him, but Both Sides of the Brain would be celebrating an anniversary, and I'm only doing 5-year increments basically. It has to be at least 10 years old, because other than that, it's just not an important anniversary to me. I'm not going to do 7, 8, 9, 24, 22-year anniversaries. There'd be so much. And like I said, this is just stuff that I've owned and stuff that has influenced my tastes. So there's plenty of other anniversaries that I'm sure I'm missing, but let's continue on. Distillers' self-titled record, Distillers, comes out April of 2000, also celebrating 20 years again. And one of the earlier punk records I was exposed to, the punk I grew up on was a combination of stuff that you could classify as actual punk and stuff that you can now classify as more being in the bubblegum punk when I was younger, or pop punk now, emo, later emo, because obviously the early 90s emo is different. So anyways, they were kind of an early thing for me that I discovered. I was really into Rancid, I was really into AFI, but then I was also into like Green Day, Blink-182, the stuff that you would argue is definitely not punk. Distillers is definitely way more punk. Same thing with Rancid. Same thing with early AFI. Later AFI, obviously, it changed to a totally different animal. But anyways, Distillers self-titled is just awesome from start to finish. Brody Dalle was just one of those artists that I was like, man, she is pissed off, and I love it. This is great. Highly recommend that record as well. Next up, we have Dozer in the Tail of the Comet. Came out April of 2000 as well, celebrating 20 years. This was one of the early stoner rock albums I got into. As far as when I started working at the record store that I've been at for the past 15 years, there was a lot of music that I kind of exposed myself to. Other people I was working with also recommended artists to me. And so stoner rock was one of those genres that immediately caught my attention because, I was into stuff like Sabbath and Deep Purple and all this other stuff before I even started working there. So to me, this kind of has that aesthetic, but a little bit more dirty sounding. Everybody calls it desert rock, for a lot of the early Queens of the Stone Age stuff or nebulous stuff. A lot of the early Man's Rue and stuff in general is almost classified as like the desert rock. And they even have the desert rock sessions where a lot of those artists contribute and play in a huge super group basically where they're, in and out of lineup changes and just everybody's kind of working on a project together. And so Dozer was one of my early exposures to that genre, and I just always thought that this album was pretty amazing. Anything on Man's Ruin at that point I was pretty much hooked for, so I would buy anything on that label. So recommend this one as well. Great record. April 2005, Despised Icons, The Healing Process celebrates 15 years. This was kind of early exposure for me as well, like I've talked about in my old anniversary video. A lot of my experience, or even just later on in this video, or earlier on in this video, my experience was a lot of the stuff that I just grew up on. So Korn, Mudvayne, Limp Bizkit, Stained, Cold, a lot of that stuff. So when I first started getting into the heavier side of like death metal and metalcore or deathcore, this stuff just ripped my face off. I didn't know how to, I couldn't handle it. It was just too much. But Despised Icon was one of those groups that teetered the edge for me to where they weren't super heavy, and eventually I got into that stuff. But it was a very nice like gateway into that genre for me. It wasn't super fast, but it had the guttural vocals, very heavy, did have a lot of blasty parts, but also mixed it up with some heavy groove, a lot of chunky riffs, and so it was a little bit easier for me to digest at the time. Still highly influential for what I later then would appreciate more and where my passions would go. I'm definitely more into the death metal now than I ever was. And great record. Highly recommend it. Celebrating 15 years. Coffin Worm, When All Becomes None, came out April 2010, celebrating 10 years. So it is so far the baby in my list. They were a later band that I discovered. Obviously, discovered them when they came out. Again, it was unlike a lot of the stuff I had heard, so that kind of then caused me to go down a whole nother rabbit hole of music, because they kind of fall into like almost like the crust punk, but they're almost like hardcore, metalcore, but it's real sludgy, kind of southern sounding. So, bands like Black Breath obviously come to mind, early Tragedy, or just Tragedy in general, because they were a very short-lived band and they only had like 3 albums. But a lot of that stuff comes to mind, and so this was kind of what exposed me into that. They have a little bit more blackened sound than their counterparts, but it's still kind of in the same vein. So I highly recommend this record as well. Really great, and definitely got me into a lot more of that, subgenre of metal. Dr. Dog, Shame Shame, came out April 2010. So again, we got another baby here on our list, 10 years old. Dr. Dog was one of those bands that I was first exposed with We All Belong. Really great record as well. Kind of has like a very Beatles, Beach Boys kind of sound to it. Lo-fi rock, but it has, like I said, like a very poppy-ish kind of sound. Their earlier stuff, though, was way more lo-fi. Sounds like it was recorded on a cassette tape, but I love it. And so after listening to We All Belong, obviously they just became one of those bands that I'll just buy anything for. I went backwards with Toothbrush and some of the earlier EPs. Really liked those, and then as they progressed, I just kept going with those guys. Ornette Coleman's Change of the Century came out May of 1960. Definitely something I exposed myself to later on. A lot of the free jazz stuff when I first started getting into jazz, again, was just too much. I couldn't understand it. It didn't have a rhythm. It was too much. It was way all over the place. Nothing made sense. They were doing weird stuff with their horns, and the sounds that were coming out of them were just unnatural, and I hated it. It was just too much. However, once I got more into the fusion stuff, and then into the bop and the post-bop, it then made more sense to me. And I understood then more of what these guys were trying to do to bring to the genre, and really appreciate it. This record celebrates 60 years this year. Probably one of my favorite Ornette Coleman records. He obviously has put out tons of other great stuff if you're familiar with the artist. But this is one that I would definitely recommend checking out if you're into your more experimental kind of free jazz. Very avant-garde, but definitely worth your time. Trapeze, with their self-titled album Trapeze, came out May of 1970, celebrating 50 years this year. Amazing record to me. This is their first record. Glenn Hughes from Deep Purple. This was his band prior to starting Deep Purple. Their self-titled record sounds nothing like what they did afterwards. Their second 2 records, Medusa and You Are the Music, We Are the Band, are definitely more akin to what he would do with Deep Purple. More of like the heavy rock type of stuff. with the self-titled record, they definitely kind of had more of that Beatles sound. You know, very just pop rock oriented, early 70s, but it still felt like the late 60s. So it sounded like everything that was being put out around that time, Yardbirds, Birds, you know, that kind of stuff, basically. And so this was a really great record, though. It really opened up my eyes to bands that weren't the ones that I knew. You know, I was very familiar with Beatles and Beach Boys and Yardbirds and the Byrds, because this is other stuff that my dad was into. And so trapeze kind of brought a little bit something different to it. Obviously, since they were going to later incorporate more hard rock into their stuff, this album definitely has some of that going on, you know, but more to the stylings of Beatles or, you know, the aforementioned bands. Betty Davis, Nasty Gal, came out in May 1975, celebrating 45 years this year. And wow, when I first heard Betty Davis, I was like, this is the sexiest woman alive. And now that I'm saying alive, I don't know if she's alive or not. I am fairly certain she died years ago. But obviously it's something I'm going to have to look up now. But anyways, I was so blown away. I didn't know what to expect, obviously. I hadn't listened to a whole lot of funk at that point in my life. And so I didn't even listen to a whole lot of like female artists at that point in my life. And so Betty Davis just came in and was just like, you know, and I was like, holy crap, I didn't know girls did this kind of music. This is amazing. Super funky. She has like this really raspy voice, you know, that gets raspier through different parts of the song, sometimes borderline like a scream. You know, she's very much in control and in your face, and she wants you to know that, and it's just amazing. Love it. Clutch, self-titled album Clutch, came out in May 1995, another one celebrating 25 years, and another one that I would kind of lump in with the, you know, Dozer stuff for me. It was my early exposure to the stoner rock stuff. Obviously, the first Clutch album, I think, is a little bit different than a lot of the genre. They were basically the pioneers, you know, them and Nebula and Queens of the Stone Age. I think Queens of the Stone Age was a couple years later, but they were all around the same time in the mid-90s, late 90s, and they were basically the pioneers, the frontrunners of this genre. Clutch did something a little bit different than their peers, however, later on kind of moved more towards that, still stayed in a realm very much of their own, though. I would still argue that Clutch does not sound anything like their peers, but they definitely have similar stylings, and so it makes sense why they get lumped into that stoner rock genre. Integrity, Systems Overloaded, May 1995, celebrating 25 years. Another album that was an early exposure for me. I didn't know a whole lot of hardcore at all, other than like Hatebreed and some Snapcase, and I don't know, I can't even think, other random things that I grew up on when I was in high school. And so to me, Integrity was different. They were almost more borderline thrash. Sven had like these super pissed off vocals. You know, Jamie was always pissed off, obviously, and the hardcore that I was familiar with was still kind of pissed off, but it borderlined almost to emo stuff. So it wasn't true hardcore, but at the time that was what I was familiar with. So these guys came in and just kicked my teeth in, and I was like, wow, I had no idea again that music could be like this. And so again, shaped everything that came afterwards. Morbid Angel, Domination, May of 1995, another 25 year. Not my favorite Morbid Angel, again. I would have to say Covenant is probably my favorite, 2 years prior to. I think that was 93 at least. But it's not an anniversary we can celebrate because of my criteria. So this one makes the list. And obviously still amazing. I don't really think Morbid Angel has done anything besides the Ilium, Illuvium, whatever that album's called. It's got the 3 words to it, but that album's kind of bad. It's not a Morbid Angel record. And whereas there's songs I definitely don't mind, overall, I don't like what he's trying on that record. So back to Domination, a bunch of great songs on it. awesome follow-up to Covenant, so, you know, no reason why you shouldn't check it out if you haven't. If you like early 90s death metal, definitely check it out. These guys were pioneers, and Domination didn't disappoint. Suffocation, Pierce from Within, May 1995 as well. Same month as the old Morbid Angel Domination. However, Suffocation did something that I feel like nobody was doing at the time. Not that they were necessarily any more technical than anybody else, however, their songwriting, Terrence Hobbs was a beast, and he definitely kind of brought a little bit different elements to death metal than anybody else at the time was bringing. And Pierce from Within is my favorite Suffocation record. I can't say easily in a top place in my favorite death metal records of all time, but I would have to somehow force it into my top 10 somewhere. It'd be so hard. But this album blew my mind and still continues to blow my mind. Suffocation was just, I feel like, not heads and shoulders above anybody else, but they were definitely putting out some of the greatest death metal of that era. And I would argue that mostly better than their peers. You know, to me, Suffocation is just one of those bands that later on stuff I still really appreciated, but I don't think it's hard to match them at their prime. Incantation, Infernal Storm, celebrates 20 years from May of 2000. Another death metal band that, when I first got into them, I had no idea what to expect. They are dirty, not super, super fast, but it is just, it can be fast or can be very blasty, just like every other death metal band. But it's just very dirty. The sound is really raw. His vocals are guttural, but to a certain degree, they're almost more frightening. And so Infernal Storm wasn't my introduction. Again, I always try to start off at the beginning, so Onward to Golgotha was the first one I listened to. But Infernal Storm being 2000, the recording was different than it was in 1992, I think, when Golgotha came out, or 91. Because I think it came out the same year as Altars of Madness from Morbid Angel. But anyways, Infernal Storm was just dirty. They were doing some crazy stuff with the guitar. It was just a great record. And again, blew my mind. I had no idea what to expect from the genre. And I was still very early on. And this album just, again, was just like, holy crap. I didn't know music could do this. Luddite Clone, Arsonist, and the Architect came out May of 2000, celebrating 20 years now. Another group that, again, kind of like the Integrity, just kicked my teeth in. I was exposed to these guys around the same time as I was exposed to Dillinger. Very similar to Dillinger, not nearly as time-changey as Dillinger. Not to say they're not, because it is definitely chaotic and crazy. And definitely in the Dillinger vein. If you like early Dillinger, like Calculating Infinity or Under the Running Board, this is definitely something that would be up your alley. Not a whole lot of people know about them, so to me this was an important record just because they were very short-lived. They put out 2 albums and then they were done. And I think those 2 records are incredible, and to me they should have been just as important as Dillinger was, but they just weren't, unfortunately. 1349 with Hellfire came out May of 2005, celebrating 15 years this year. Again, you know, this was you're going to hear again a lot, and I'm sorry. But this is another one that I had really no idea of what black metal could sound like. I knew bands like Children of Bodom, which to me, being an uninformed kid, felt more blackish. However, now I understand that they definitely have more in along the lines of the Swedish death metal scene. They're very more symphonic, though. They kind of have their blackish elements, but I always lumped them with like Cradle of Filth and Demon Borgir and stuff like that. So that was my knowledge of black metal, quote unquote. 1349 was one of those bands that it is just blast beat from start to finish. The riffs are so fast. His vocals are so scary, and it just was, again, just like getting kicked in the face. And I was like, what am I listening to? This is, oh my God, it is so fast. how are they doing this, basically? Again, now I kind of listen to more music. Their drumming is, whereas it's incredible, that guy's a beast. I know it's triggered. He wouldn't be able to hit that clean of a sound for as long as he does without it being a triggered sound. So, like, it's definitely not him doing it on his own. Doesn't take away from the music. The music is still just aggressive in your face. If you like your black metal without keys and just clean, not super cold or sounding like, you know, poor sound quality, basically. Very clean recording, very aggressive and in your face, similar to Marduk. And this is just something that, again, blew my mind, and I had no idea that music could do this, and everything was history afterwards. Team Sleep with Team Sleep came out May of 2005, celebrating 15 years. This was a side group of Chino Moreno from Deftones, and I believe there was a few other people in this group that were pretty relevant at the time. However, their names are escaping me now. But this was totally different than anything that Chino was doing with Deftones. I was a big Deftones fan, but at that time in my life, I wasn't exposed to a whole lot of alternative stuff. I was very much in the mindset that if it wasn't heavy, I didn't want to listen to it, you know. I was angry. Alternative music was stupid. So this was one of those bands that I had a huge love and respect for Chino, so I gave it a chance and I fell in love. Brain Drill, Quantum Catastrophes in May of 2010, also celebrating 10 years. Again, one of those bands that I just didn't know that this kind of stuff existed. Super flashy, hyper technical, very fast. Marco Puzzarelli, I can never pronounce his name, does something on the drums that I couldn't understand. He was going so fast, I didn't think it was humanly possible. He's got a technique that now I've since then discovered. A couple other people in the music biz have the same technique. Doesn't make it any less complicated. It's crazy when people do it, and they can do it well, and it sounds good. But he is a nasty drummer, and the guitar player just plays some crazy riffs, lots of sweeping. It is just hyper technical, super aggressive. Again, I didn't know music could be like this, and so I was hooked. Crystal Castles with the self-titled album Crystal Castles, May of 2010, another 10-year anniversary for these ones. Electronic duo that it's a little bit more pop electronic. However, this record was a little bit weird, a little bit more bizarre, has a lot of weird screeching with the vocals, can get pretty intense in the music, gets fast and sped up, and really comes at you. So it's not your typical electronic music, but to me this was, you know, kind of a gateway to that style, and the rest is history. Just really like these guys and opened my eyes up to a whole lot of other things. Sleigh Bells, Treats, another 10-year from May of 2010. Another group that this is like the most metal pop group you can listen to. And it might sound weird, but they are very anthemic as far as the sound goes. It's very loud. It's just guitar and drums. But the guitars are real fuzzy and distorted. You could almost say, like I said, borderline metal to a certain degree. Her vocals are very much in the back of the mix. They're shouted, and it's just wild. Remember the first time I heard them at a bar I was at, and I was like, what the hell is this? And again, I was hooked. I thought their album right afterwards, Rain and Blood, I think is what it's called. No, that's Slayer. Reign of something, because I know it's Reign of Terror, maybe, I don't know. But again, a great record, and they just have been one for me that just hasn't produced up to the same, you know, level that they have in the past. So this record will just forever be on rotate, and it's amazing. Deep Purple in Rock, May 1970. Another very influential record to me. This was something I definitely more grew up on in my younger years, before I started working at the record store that I've been at for the last 15, before I really started to expose myself to music, before I became passionate and everything. So this record, again, was just something that I had heard, and I was like, man, this just kicks ass, and it just stuck with me. You know, just as much as Sabbath has stuck with me over the years, just as much as the next band that I will mention has stuck with me over the years. It's just early heavy rock, very influential to a lot of the metal that came afterwards. So to me, these guys were just always important. So that leads me to the next band, Uriah Heep, very heavy, very humble. Came out June of 1970. I didn't say the last one, but again, if you can't do your math, this album and Deep Purple and Rock, celebrating 50 years this year. Again, I feel like these were early precursors to the heavy metal genre. I think Deep Purple, just as much as Sabbath, even though I would say Sabbath was definitely a little bit more doomy, a little bit heavier than Deep Purple was. However, you can't argue that Deep Purple didn't have some kind of effect on where metal went later on. If a lot of these metal thrash heads weren't listening to Deep Purple, I think they were crazy, you know. If I heard that Tom Morello or that James Hetfield were never exposed to Deep Purple, I'd be like, what the fuck is wrong with you? So, Uriah Heep, great band. David Byron was one of my favorite singers in the genre. I think he's got a very powerful voice. Always loved their music. So again, their self-titled record being a very influential record for me. Well, self-titled here and in the UK, very heavy, very humble. Bjork with Post came out June of 1995, celebrating 25 years. Bjork was definitely something that I really had to keep coming back to. I hated it for a long time. She was just too weird. She does a lot of, if you're familiar with her music, she's all over the place. Her vocal patterns can be very soft and really engaging, but then it can just be very off-putting at the same time. But I've learned to really appreciate and love that now, because I have several other female artists that I'm really into that people don't love their voices, but I do. And so, like I said, Bjork became one of those artists for me that grew on me after time. I really had to keep exposing myself to it. And it wasn't even so much forcing myself on any particular record. I would say this one's my favorite, but it was Oh So Quiet was the song that it clicked with me. And then I was just like, you know, I know this is not the same as anything else she's done. However, I wish she would do an album that is all similar to that very big sounding jazz that she did with Oh So Quiet. But it really helped me to kind of understand and appreciate the rest. I don't know why, but that's just kind of how it worked. And so Bjork has always been a very influential artist for me. Dark Throne with Panzerfaust in June 1995. It's another 25-year-old album. My exposure to Dark Throne was actually more of their punk-related stuff, so Fuck Off and Die, the, oh man, what's some of the other ones from that time period? Black Sails, I think is what it was called, and something, whatever, had a longer title. But a lot of like more of their punk kind of sound stuff was where I kind of got into Dark Throne. And then, so unlike most of the other stuff I listened to, that was just kind of a being at the right place at the right time. Somebody had that record on, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. Like, oh, it's Dark Throne, they're black metal, but they've got a lot of different periods, so definitely check out everything they've done. And so Panzerfaust is definitely, obviously, your more lo-fi, classic black metal. Very influential to genre as a whole. Very influential to what I would later on appreciate then as well. Queens of the Stone Age, rated R, June of 2000, celebrating 20 years. Queens of the Stone Age, mentioned multiple times in this video already with the front runners of the stoner rock genre. And when I first heard them, I was like, shit, this is great. This is like everything else that I was kind of exposing myself to at the time. They kind of brought their own flavor to it. I would say it's, cleaner sounding than some of their peers. So not as much as that dirty, deserty kind of sound. Not even, sometimes some of those groups got even a little bit doomy sounding to a certain degree. I feel like there's a lot of influence to Sabbath in a lot of those groups. And so Queen of the Stone Age was doing something a little bit different, a lot more beachy kind of sound, summery, very fun, energetic. And so they were instantly appealing. Made Out of Babies came out with Trophy in June of 2005, celebrating 15 years. This is one of those groups that very much helped me kind of get into that post-rock, post-metal, you know, some of those bands even get a little bit more experimental, a lot more instrumental even on that genre too, but this band really helped pave the way for that. That and Neurosis is Through Silver and Blood, Isis is Oceanic. Those were all things that I was exposed to at the time and really opened me up to that side of metal. Again, opening up another gateway. Difference being is though I was getting into a lot more like female artists at the time when I had heard Made Out of Babies. When I was in high school, you know, there was pop that I enjoyed, but I always thought it was like, it's girly to listen to female artists. You know, if it's not heavy and they're not like some badass with dreadlocks, I don't want to listen to it. And so I very much embraced more of the, let's give more female artists a try. There's probably a whole lot that I would enjoy. You know, I started getting into Bjork and, you know, Cat Power and just a whole lot of other like female artists I would have never exposed myself to. And so then Made Out of Babies comes along. Julie Christmas has this very delicate voice when she sings, but then she just screams and she is just so pissed off, and you're just like, whoa, I didn't know girls could do this. I'm a sexist turd for assuming they couldn't. And then again, there's another thing that I was like, God, this is amazing. I love this. And totally opened up the doors to, you know, the post-metal that I would start to enjoy. And I'm looking at my list and I have a whole lot more, but this video's already been kind of long. You pretty much get a gist of a lot of the stuff that have influenced me over the years. Albums that I think are important that I think you guys should check out as well. And if you like this, let's talk about some more in the comments. You know, I can always bring up some of the other ones that I didn't mention that I did have written down. I actually wrote all these artists down, went through my Discogs account at the beginning of the year, and planned these reviews out so that there was at least 4 reviews that I had material for, ready to go. All I had to do was read and record. And so here we are. That's why I was like, let's get this one done. It's been 2 weeks since I've done a video, so let's talk to everybody. I miss you guys. And so I hope you enjoy this. If there's other albums that are celebrating anniversaries that fall into our 5-year increment, 10 years or older category, let's talk about them in the comments. Love to see what you guys are talking about. Maybe it's stuff I've heard of, maybe it's stuff I haven't. We can sit there and bounce bands back and forth. I love talking about music, and I hope you guys are enjoying the channel. If you haven't, you can start following me on Instagram at Review the Right Thing. I'm also on Twitter at Right ANDD 2005, so you can follow me on there. However, I don't post much on Twitter. Twitter is more just for information for me. When I don't feel like going through a million fake news things and a bunch of stupid comments on Facebook, I can go to Twitter and look at Limited Run Games put out this game or is pre-ordering this game, or Jeff Lemire's working on this comic book right now, or whatever. Just, it's a lot more set to my tastes, whereas Facebook is more just, what the fuck is everybody doing? And Instagram, I post a lot of my collection on there. So, again, I don't get to talk about everything I pick up. However, since obviously time constraints and getting reviews done for certain things, like movies, are a little bit harder than doing reviews on music, some of my videos might start being more of my collection. You know, I've done a couple unboxing videos where I've shown off, oh, I just ordered this box of stuff from Hamilton Books, or that's the only one, or I've shown off my collection. But obviously I continue to buy more, so I can start doing updates on vinyl that I've picked up or CDs I've picked up, and we can talk about those in the comments and get a community going. You know, it'd be awesome to be able to chit chat with you guys. And if you like it, hit subscribe, click the little bell, it'll notify you every time I put up new content. Follow me on Instagram at Review the Right Thing. You get to see 30-second videos of songs I'm listening to in the morning before I get ready to work, my daily jams, new toys I pick up that I'm not reviewing, just random stuff, you know. But yeah, I don't post on there every day, but again, you get to keep a little bit more updated, see a little bit more into my life than you would these videos. And anyways, it's been great talking to you guys. Miss you guys. Love you. Stay safe. Stay smart. Treat everybody with respect. You get further with honey than you do with vinegar. And we'll be talking to you soon. Have a great one.